Before we descend into the Thornhallow Greenhouse tonight, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more chilling tales. Have you ever encountered a plant that seemed just a little too alive? Tell me in the comments below. If there's one thing a botany PhD prepares you for, it's unemployment. 4 years ago, I stood proudly in front of a crowd, diploma in hand, believing I was destined to make groundbreaking discoveries. Today, I stood in front of the Thornhallow estate, clutching a thin manila envelope and wondering if this was how groundbreaking discoveries usually began, with mildew, broken stone steps, and a smell suspiciously similar to damp socks. The estate loomed against the overcast English sky, an aging testament to forgotten grandeur. Ivy draped the facade like an invasive species staking its claim, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and something older, something that didn't quite belong. My new employer, an obscure legal trust representing the Thornhallow lineage, had contacted me 2 weeks prior. They offered an absurd sum to catalog the plant species in Sir Reginald Thornhallow's infamous greenhouse. No academic credits, no papers to publish. Just a straightforward contract with one peculiar clause: all work must be conducted on-site. Overnight stay required. A red flag? Perhaps. But beggars, particularly those with a mounting pile of student loans, could not be choosers. I hauled my battered suitcase up the steps, each one groaning under my weight, and rapped on the heavy oak door. No answer. After a moment's hesitation, I pushed. It swung inward with a reluctant creak, revealing a cavernous, dust-choked foyer. No welcome committee. No keys. No instructions. Only a narrow hallway to the right and, through cracked glass doors straight ahead, the faint shimmer of green. The greenhouse. Right? I muttered, forcing a grin. Adventure it is. The greenhouse was surreal, bigger than it had any right to be, stretching back into the mist like a Victorian fever dream. Arched glass panels, grimy but largely intact, vaulted overhead, and iron support beams, ornate with curling designs, had long since surrendered to rust, yet somehow life inside flourished. Vines as thick as my forearm slithered along trellises. Ferns unfurled like eager spectators. Blossoms bloomed in impossible colors, pulsing slightly as if breathing, and the smell, pungent, sweet, and dizzyingly complex, rolled over me like a living thing. It was magnificent. It was wrong. A rational voice in my head, the one usually tasked with stopping me from doing idiotic things, whispered, "Plants do not grow like this. Not unattended. Not here." I ignored it. Instead, I unpacked my battered field journal, flicked on my recording device, and set to work. The first few hours were typical, almost disappointingly so, cataloging, photographing, sketching leaves and flower structures. The only peculiarities were minor. A few specimens that didn't correspond to known species, odd patterns of movement among the vines as though reacting to my presence, but nothing concrete. Nothing I could not explain away with enough caffeine and self-delusion. A single line, scrawled hastily in the margin of a page: "They grow truest in darkness." I frowned. Plants, to my knowledge, were not especially known for thriving in darkness. Photosynthesis remained somewhat non-negotiable. I shook my head, closing the journal. Jet lag, I reasoned. Overactive imagination. I would learn, soon enough, that Thornhallow had not been speaking metaphorically. It started around midnight. A subtle shifting sound, like silk sliding over stone, the faint tink-tink of something tapping glass. I lay in bed, paralyzed between groggy skepticism and instinctual alarm. Another sound, a low, rhythmic creak, like old wood under strain. Except there were no trees close enough for the wind to push against. No wind at all, come to think of it. I blinked. The movement stopped, abrupt and guilty, like children caught in a forbidden act. A beat of silence. Then, a single blossom, bright crimson and the size of my fist, opened directly in my path, releasing a visible cloud of spores that hung like a shimmer in the air. My breath caught. Every scientific nerve in my body screamed at me to retreat. Instead, I whispered aloud, because sometimes idiocy demands ceremony, right? Probably just a very enthusiastic rhododendron. With a courage born largely of sleep deprivation and debt, I stepped forward. The air thickened. Every step deeper into the greenhouse felt like wading through syrup. Shadows danced just beyond my vision. The tang of earth and pollen became almost sickly sweet. As I approached the central garden, an open, circular clearing surrounded by thick, mossy pillars, I noticed something new, a patch of ground unnaturally free of growth, as if something had scorched it into perfect baldness. In the center stood a plinth of cracked marble, atop which rested a single, battered brass plaque, Somniflora attendit ad somnum aeternum. I barely had time to process before the world tilted. The spores hit me fully now, thick enough to taste sweet, metallic, cloying. Colors deepened to impossible saturation. The whispers began, not words at first, but sensations, a longing, a welcome, a hunger. I stumbled back, gasping, but the greenhouse seemed determined to swallow me whole. Vines brushed against my arms, gently at first, then more insistently. Petals brushed my cheeks like curious fingers. Panic surged. I bolted for the door, the path behind me writhing, plants closing ranks to herd me forward. I burst into the caretaker's quarters and slammed the door, chest heaving. Then, faintly, from beyond the glass, a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. As if 100 leafy fingers were knocking in unison, inviting me back. Sleep found me like a drowning man finds a rope, sudden, desperate, and unavoidable. Whether it was the spores, the exhaustion, or something more insidious, I couldn't tell. The dreams came almost immediately. At first, they were innocent enough. Endless corridors of green, flowers opening and closing rhythmically like breathing lungs. But soon, the corridors began to narrow, vines tightening into coils. The breathing deepened, slowed, until I realized it wasn't my lungs expanding and contracting. It was the walls themselves. Then the voice began. Not a voice, precisely. More like 1,000 petals brushing against my mind, forming suggestions rather than words. Welcome, curator. We have waited. The dream shifted. I stood at the center of the greenhouse, the plinth before me, but the sleep flower was no longer absent. It bloomed in grotesque glory, an enormous blossom, shimmering with colors my waking mind couldn't categorize. As I stared, the flower shuddered, and from its center, something emerged, a figure, humanoid yet vegetal, skin composed of green-veined leaves and bark. Its eyes were blossoms themselves, blooming and wilting in slow succession. It raised a hand. A mass of vines twisted into 5 crude fingers and beckoned. I woke up screaming into my pillow, heart jackhammering against my ribs. Morning, if it could be called that, under Thornhallow's eternal mist, brought no reprieve. The plants were still. The glass was unbroken. The greenhouse waited with the patient stillness of a predator. After several minutes spent convincing myself that mental breakdowns were just part of the scientific process, and perhaps even tax-deductible, I resolved to continue my work. After all, hallucinations didn't catalog themselves. Armed with a field journal, a pocket recorder, and an unhealthy level of stubbornness, I plunged once more into the green. I began my documentation methodically, row by row, plant by plant. Sketches, measurements, specimen collection. The strangeness, however, intensified. Plants shifted ever so slightly when I wasn't looking. Notes left open were mysteriously annotated with corrections I hadn't made. Worse, some species seemed to respond when I spoke aloud, leaves tilting toward my voice, tendrils quivering in apparent attention. It was, I noted grimly, the worst possible time to remember that my doctoral dissertation included a full chapter on plant intelligence and reactive behavior. What had once been an intriguing academic theory was now a claustrophobic reality. At one point, after accidentally bumping into a thorny vine, I muttered under my breath, "Sorry, pal." The vine recoiled immediately, curling away in what could only be described as offense. I stared, then scribbled furiously into my journal. Note: possible tactile response in Vitis thornhallowensis. Emotional sensitivity, questionable. Midway through the afternoon, while cataloging a strange cluster of iridescent mushrooms, definitely not native to England or any known biome, I stumbled across an iron-bound chest half buried in the loam. Curiosity, that faithful saboteur of better judgment, kicked in. The chest creaked open with minimal resistance, revealing its contents: old, leather-bound journals, dozens of them. The topmost was embossed with a familiar sigil, the stylized T of Thornhallow. I opened it carefully. Inside, Thornhallow's handwriting, tight, precise, slightly deranged, spilled across the pages. The entries were a revelation. Somniflora, not merely sentient collective. Root network functions as single organism. Memory. Intent. Initial communication achieved via spore-induced dream states. Greenhouse itself. An extension of will. I will become part of it. In dream and in waking. I sat back on my heels, blood running cold. Sir Reginald hadn't vanished. He had joined them. That evening, I sat in the caretaker's quarters, poring over the journals. The pieces began falling into place. The sleep flower, Somniflora, was not just a plant. It was a hive mind, connecting all botanical life within the greenhouse. Spores facilitated not just reproduction but communication. Over time, exposure led to irreversible assimilation into the network. The quiet dread settled in my gut that I realized, with the clarity of someone watching their own slow-motion train wreck, that every breath I took inside that place brought me closer to Thornhallow's fate. Outside, the greenhouse pulsed faintly in the mist, a sleeping giant dreaming of me. And yet, despite the terror simmering under my ribs, another feeling gnawed at me. What if I could document the phenomenon? What if I could understand it? After all, knowledge was power, wasn't it? I laughed bitterly to myself. PhD, I muttered, giving you the qualifications needed to argue metaphysics with a telepathic fern. Outside, faint laughter, or something unsettlingly close, rustled through the leaves. The next night, I decided to test a theory if Thornhallow's journals were accurate, and by now, I'd wager my last scientific grant they were. Then the sleep flower could be coaxed into revealing itself. It required three things: proximity, vulnerability, and intent that I had already given it the first two by breathing its spores and dreaming in its grasp. All that remained was to offer my intent. I set up in the central atrium, the plinth looming like an altar before me. Around me, the plants shifted subtly, as if breathing in sync with my own shallow breaths. The mist within the glass walls had thickened unnaturally, hanging heavy like a curtain between worlds. I spoke aloud, because somehow it felt expected. I am here to understand. I am here to listen. For a long, unbearable moment, nothing happened. Then a low, deep vibration thrummed through the soil underfoot. Leaves trembled in a soundless wind. From the plinth, a new growth erupted, rapid, obscene. Like muscle tissue forming before my eyes, it twisted upward, thickened, and bloomed. The sleep flower. In the dim light, it was a terrible beauty. Layers upon layers of petals folding into impossible geometries, colors that hurt to look at directly. The air grew thick with its scent, not floral, but metallic, like blood and rain and old promises. The flower leaned toward me. Again, the whisper brush of mental contact. Understand us, join. Visions flooded my mind. Vast root systems spanning centuries. Knowledge carried in sap and leaf. A communal existence beyond fear, beyond loneliness. It was tempting. God help me, it was seductive. But buried beneath the wonder was something darker, a loss of individuality. A drowning in the collective consciousness. There would be no me in their world, only us. The choice was clear, and it wasn't one Thornhallow had resisted for long. But me, I've always been stubborn. It's why it took me 7 years and 3 mental breakdowns to finish my doctorate. I stepped back. No, I said hoarsely. I'll observe, but I won't join. The reaction was immediate. The greenhouse shuddered. Tendrils lashed outward from the soil, vines thickening and writhing with furious purpose. The very architecture of the place seemed to groan in outrage, glass panels flexing against their frames. 1,000 mental voices screamed in unison. Selfish, broken, belonged. I ran. The paths I'd memorized twisted impossibly. Walls of thorns closed off exits that had been there moments before. The plants were rearranging the space itself, hurting me, trapping me like an insect in an infinitely complex web. I sprinted toward the caretaker's quarters. But even that familiar refuge seemed miles away, the floor beneath me a treacherous mat of shifting roots. Somewhere behind me, the sleep flower pulsed, an organ pumping malice into every tendril. My lungs burned. Every breath dragged spores deeper into my bloodstream. Shapes moved alongside me. Humanoid silhouettes formed of bark and moss. Faces twisted into parodies of human expressions. Were they failed curators? Or merely another hallucination? At that point, did it even matter? Reaching the old generator room, a fortified stone structure Thornhallow must have added later, I slammed the heavy door behind me, gasping. For the first time in what felt like hours, the mental pressure lessened. The greenhouse, it seemed, couldn't penetrate cold iron and stone. At least, not yet. I sagged against the wall, heart pounding. On the battered workbench, my recorder, forgotten during my earlier wanderings, blinked softly. A single audio file had been recorded automatically. Trembling, I pressed play. A whisper issued from the device. Overlapping voices layered into one chilling command. Return to us. Or wither alone. I switched it off with a shaky laugh. Yeah, I muttered. Great sales pitch. Real 5-star Yelp material. The room trembled slightly. Not funny, apparently. Hours passed, maybe days. Time had grown slippery inside Thornhallow. I rationed the emergency supplies. Barely enough for a weekend camping trip, let alone a siege. Sleep became a dangerous gamble. Every time I drifted off, the dreams grew stronger, more persuasive. They promised warmth. Acceptance, an end to struggle. They also promised the permanent erasure of everything that made me me. Finally, on what might have been the 4th night, the greenhouse made its final move. Roots punched through the stone walls, slow but inevitable. The air filled with the smell of damp earth and blooming terror. I had one shot left. During my scavenging, I discovered Thornhallow's old incinerator, a relic from when dead plants had to be properly disposed of. Crude, but effective. If I could reach it, if I could torch the sleep flower, maybe just maybe, I could sever the hive mind. Or die trying to at that point. Honestly, it felt like a win-win. I packed what I could carry. A can of kerosene. A flare gun. Thornhallow's journal tucked into my jacket. And with a whispered prayer to every deity and scientific principle I had ever abandoned, I kicked the door open and plunged once more into the green. The greenhouse greeted my return like a wounded beast. The walls of green had thickened into grotesque bulges, pulsing rhythmically. Tendrils writhed along the glass, searching blindly for prey. Every step felt heavier, as if the soil itself mourned my rebellion. I kept moving, one hand tied around the kerosene can, the other on the flare gun at my belt. The path to the plinth was no longer straight. The greenhouse, angered, had reshaped itself in defiance. Roots erupted from the ground. Blocking old routes. I hacked through them with a rusted machete I'd scavenged from the tool shed, the blade vibrating with every impact. Somewhere ahead, the sleep flower throbbed, a heartbeat echoing through my bones. The hive mind spoke again, but now its tone had shifted, not persuasion, not seduction. Traitor, unworthy, ash to ash, which, frankly, sounded a lot like my last academic peer review. The final approach to the plinth was a nightmare. The humanoid figures, the others, had grown more solid. Their leafy faces twisted in anguish and accusation, their arms outstretched like supplicants or executioners. Every instinct screamed at me to run.to give up.to sink into the soft, forgiving earth. But stubbornness, that most underappreciated survival trait, drove me forward. I broke into a sprint. At last, the central atrium yawned open before me. The sleep flower towered above the plinth now, grotesquely swollen, its petals unfolding and folding in endless obscene motions. The air around it shimmered with spores, a living cloud of consciousness. It saw me. It knew me, and it hated me. Without hesitation, I hurled the kerosene can at its base. It struck true, splashing liquid fire across the plinth and the hungry roots clutching it. The sleep flower recoiled, an ear-splitting psychic scream shattering the air. I pulled the flare gun free, aimed, and fired. Time slowed. The flare streaked through the heavy mist, a comet of desperate defiance, and struck home. The explosion was not chemical. It was alive. The greenhouse howled. Flames raced up the vines, across the glass, devouring centuries of growth in an instant. The sleep flower convulsed, petals blackening, collapsing inward like a dying star. Around me, the others shrieked, not with voices, but through the rustle and crackle of burning leaves as they disintegrated into ash. The hive mind crumbled, piece by piece, root by root, and with it, the spell over Thornhallow's cursed greenhouse. I staggered backward, barely avoiding a falling beam as the structure began to implode. Glass shattered in great weeping sheets. The soil beneath my feet steamed and cracked. Somewhere deep within the inferno, I thought I saw Sir Reginald himself, or what was left of him, reaching out from within the collapsing sleep flower, a grotesque blend of human and plant, mouthing something I was very grateful not to hear. I didn't stay to watch him die. I burst through the crumbling front door into the open air, coughing black smoke from my lungs. Behind me, the Thornhallow Greenhouse collapsed in on itself, a fiery tomb for the knowledge and madness it had birthed. The mist devoured the ruins swiftly, swallowing the flames until all that remained was a faint, sickly glow on the horizon. It was over. Or so I told myself. I never went back for the journals. Part of me wishes I had, if only to prevent anyone else from stumbling into Thornhallow's legacy. But a bigger part of me, the part that wakes sweating at 3 a.m., knows better. Some knowledge isn't meant to be recovered. Some seeds, once planted, never truly die. Even now, sometimes when the fog rolls heavy over the fields, I catch a whiff of something metallic on the air, a scent like blood, rain, and old promises. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear the faint rustle of leaves whispering my name. If you survived the night with the sleep flower, give this video a thumbs up and share it with a fellow horror lover. What supernatural horror should we explore next? Leave your suggestions. They might just become our next nightmare.